It is a cold morning in late November 1990. In a quiet parking lot in Reigate, Surrey, a security van is making its routine cash collections. Two figures in dark boiler suits and rubber Ronald Reagan masks approach the van with unnerving calm. They are armed with sawn-off shotguns. These men have done this sort of thing before. Inside the van, the guards are still unaware of the danger creeping toward them. In seconds, the masked gunmen spring into action. One slams a sledgehammer against the van's windshield, cracking it with a thunderous blow, while the other raises his shotgun and yells for the guards to surrender. It looks like another seamless armed robbery by London's most audacious gang. But today, fate has different plans. From the periphery of the lot, shouts erupt. Armed police. A dozen officers who have been lying in wait reveal themselves. The would-be robbers spin in surprise. A flurry of gunshots shatters the cold morning air. In the chaos, one of the masked assailants, a gang associate named Kenneth Baker, lifts his shotgun to fire, but he's instantly cut down by police bullets. He crumples to the ground, fatally wounded. The driver of the gang's pickup truck, Mehmet Arif, tries to ram his way out, but a police marksman's bullet finds him, striking him in the chest. Mehmet slumps over, badly injured but alive. The second masked robber, Mehmet's brother Deniz Arif, drops his weapon and finds himself tackled to the concrete by officers. The entire showdown is over within moments. As the police secure the scene, they pull the grotesque Reagan masks off the captives to reveal two of South London's most notorious underworld figures, Mehmet and Deniz Arif. The brothers, key members of the infamous Arif crime family, are finally in handcuffs. For over a decade, their family's name had been whispered in backrooms and bar parlors across London, synonymous with fear, violence, and untouchable power. Now, in this parking lot turned battleground, the law has struck a rare and resounding blow against them. This botched robbery and shootout marks a turning point in the story of the Arif family. To understand how these men became bold enough to attempt a daylight cash van heist, and why police were so ready for them, we must journey back through the shadowy rise of the Arif crime family, back to the streets of South London decades earlier. The story of the Arifs begins in the 1960s in the working-class districts of South London. The family, of Turkish Cypriot origin, had settled in Britain by the mid-20th century, planting roots in areas like Rotherhithe and along the Old Kent Road. They were a large family, by some counts 7 brothers, along with sisters and a network of cousins. Life for immigrant families in those days was hard, and opportunity was scarce. The Arif brothers found theirs not in conventional trades or education, but in the shadowy corners of the city's underbelly. As teenagers and young men, the Arifs started off with the typical street hustles of the era. They ran with local gangs, engaged in petty theft, street fights, and the occasional burglary. In the late 1960s, South London's criminal landscape was in flux. The era of the Cray twins and the Richardson gang, once the kings of London's organised crime, was ending, leaving a power vacuum. Ambitious and street-smart, the Arif brothers sensed an opening. They were determined to climb the criminal ladder, and they had the fearlessness to do it. By the 1970s, the Arifs had graduated to more serious crimes. They learned the rackets that could sustain an underworld empire, extortion of local businesses, protection schemes, and armed robbery. Even in these early years, a reputation for brutality began to form around the family. People who crossed the Arifs or refused to pay what was asked of them would be made examples of. One notorious anecdote that circulated in underworld circles involved the eldest brother, Dogan Arif. It was said that Dogan had a chilling way of making introductions during shakedowns. He would jam the barrel of his handgun into a victim's mouth mid-conversation. The threat needed no translation. This was how the Arifs operated, through raw intimidation enforced by their own hands. The first time the Arif name truly surfaced in the press was May 1977, when a security van robbery in South London turned deadly. Early one morning, a security van carrying cash was attacked by a gang of armed men. The robbers smashed the armored windshield with a sledgehammer and sprayed the interior with shotgun blasts, forcing the guards to surrender. In the violent frenzy during a major robbery. However, the trial resulted in a stunning outcome. Osar Arif was acquitted of the murder. The prosecution couldn't make the charges stick, possibly due to lack of concrete evidence or witnesses too frightened to testify. Another Arif brother, Bakir, was convicted on a lesser charge related to the robbery, disposing of the firearms used in the crime, and served about 5 years in prison. But for the most part, the family walked away from the 1977 incident with minimal consequences. That close call only bolstered the Arifs' daring. By the early 1980s, the brothers had firmly established themselves in the South London underworld. They were no longer just street thugs, they were evolving into sophisticated criminals. With earnings from robberies and extortion, they began investing in ostensibly legitimate enterprises. The Arifs acquired pubs, clubs, and properties in their territory. These businesses served a dual purpose. They laundered dirty money and also acted as strongholds for their operations. A pub under Arif control might host covert meetings among gangsters in a back room, or a nightclub they ran could double as a marketplace for drugs flowing through their network. During this era, the Arifs were one of a handful of dominant crime families in London. Another was the Clerkenwell Syndicate, led by the Adams brothers in North London. Fortunately for both, a turf war between them never materialized. By most accounts, the Arifs and the Adams clan maintained a pragmatic peace, even cooperating at times to avoid mutual destruction. They tacitly respected each other's zones of influence, the Arifs largely south of the River Thames, the Adams family north, knowing that open conflict would only attract more police attention and jeopardize the lucrative drug and racketeering markets from which both profited. They were not without competition. Other Turkish and Kurdish syndicates, such as the infamous Bay Basin Cartel, were also active in smuggling heroin into Britain. However, the Arifs leveraged a mix of negotiation and intimidation to keep a strong hold on London's share of the trade, ensuring that rivals found little foothold in their city. By the end of the 1980s, the Arif crime family had reached a zenith of power. The brothers had become one of the most feared gangs in the entire capital, especially in the southeast boroughs they called home. People in neighborhoods like Peckham, Bermondsey, and Camberwell understood that certain clubs or cafes were effectively Arif territory, and that any trouble in those spots could invite a visit from hard-faced enforcers ready to dole out punishment. The Metropolitan Police were well aware of the Arifs' growing influence but struggled to infiltrate their ranks. The family was clannish and insular, they trusted only each other and a few close associates, many sharing their Turkish Cypriot background. This closed nature made it exceedingly difficult for undercover officers or informants to get near the inner circle. Crucially, around the same time, a new illicit opportunity was exploding: narcotics. The late 1970s and 1980s saw heroin pour into Western Europe, often routed from the poppy fields of the Middle East through Turkey. The Arifs were perfectly positioned to capitalize on this deadly trade. Leveraging connections to their homeland and contacts in the Turkish and Turkish Cypriot communities abroad, the Arifs became key importers of high-grade heroin into London. They oversaw a pipeline that brought the drug from suppliers overseas straight into the veins of London's addicts. With the profits from narcotics dwarfing those from robberies, the Arifs' wealth swelled. They reinvested in more drugs and more bribes, greasing the wheels to keep their operation running smoothly. By the end of the 1980s, the Arif family was flush with cash and confidence. They had become, as some would later call them, Britain's top crime family. Yet despite their infamy in the underworld, the Arifs themselves remained ghosts to the public at large. They weren't splashed on newspaper front pages, nor did they cultivate celebrity personas like the old East End gangsters once did. They moved quietly, preferring influence over notoriety. Their power was felt in hushed threats and secret deals, not in public swagger. That secrecy served them well, shielding them from the full glare of law enforcement attention for many years. However, the Arifs' dominance was about to be challenged in a way they perhaps did not anticipate. From fellow gangsters close to home. Organized crime is seldom a peaceful enterprise, and as the Arifs grew rich and strong, other groups watched with envy and resentment. Among those rivals were two clans rooted in South London's criminal milieu: the Brindle family and the Daly family. It was only a matter of time before their paths collided violently with the Arifs, setting off one of London's most notorious gangland feuds. The spark that ignited the war came in the summer of 1990. On an August night, the Queen Elizabeth pub in Woolworth was winding down for the evening when a group of armed men stormed through the doors. They headed straight for the landlord, John Daly, who was in the middle of chatting with regulars. In the blink of an eye, one intruder pressed a pistol hard against Daly's lips, while others brandished weapons at the stunned patrons. The gunmen demanded money, taxes for operating on what they claimed was their turf. It was a naked act of extortion, executed with military-style aggression. These attackers were enforcers linked to the Brindle family, a rival South London gang with roots in the same patch of ground the Arifs considered theirs. The Dalys, the family of the pub owner now staring down the barrel of a gun, had ties of friendship and possibly kinship with the Arifs. By targeting John Daly, the Brindles were not just muscling in on a profitable pub. They were directly challenging the Arif sphere of influence. It was an unspoken rule of the underworld. Certain businesses were under certain families' protection. The Brindles had just broken that rule in the most provocative way. The humiliation of having a gun forced into his mouth in front of his patrons was not something John Daly or the Arifs behind him would let pass. Word of the Queen Elizabeth pub incident spread quickly through Gangland networks. The message from the Brindles was clear: "We're coming for what's yours." The Arifs and their allies prepared to answer, and they would not wait long. Barely a few weeks later, retaliation came. Late at night in September 1990, the pulsating bass of a South London nightclub was interrupted by gunfire. Amidst the panicked screams and flurry of people diving for cover, one man lay collapsed on the sticky floor, blood seeping through his club attire. He was Steve Dogan, a known associate and friend of the Brindle family. The shooter, witnesses later recounted, was a Turkish man who had been quietly tailing Dogan inside the club. That man was Ahmet Abi Abdullah, a cousin of the Arif brothers and one of their most trusted lieutenants. Abdullah had emptied a handgun into Dogan at near point-blank range, hitting him multiple times before slipping away in the confusion. Miraculously, Dogan survived despite being shot 7 times, but he was grievously wounded. The attack on him was a brazen statement. The Arifs had answered the Queen Elizabeth pub incident blow for blow. A member of the Brindle circle had been targeted in a public venue and left for dead. London's underworld knew now that a feud had begun in earnest. Both sides were on high alert, weaponed up and looking over their shoulders. The feud escalated at a terrifying pace, soon drawing blood on the Arif side as well. On a chilly morning in March 1991, at a William Hill betting shop on Woolworth Road, punters were placing their bets on horse races and football matches, oblivious to the hitmen in their midst. Without warning, shots rang out inside the busy shop. Amid the chaos of customers scrambling for the exit, one man lay dying on the floor, Ahmet Abi Abdullah. The killers, 2 unidentified gunmen, had slipped in, executed their target with clinical precision, and vanished into the streets before anyone could react. Abdullah's lifeless body was left sprawled among scattered betting slips. The murder of Abi Abdullah sent shockwaves through the Arif family. He wasn't just an associate, he was kin. Dogan Arif's own cousin and a loyal foot soldier who had shed blood for the family. The brazenness of the hit, carried out in broad daylight, signaled that the Brindles were equally determined to settle scores. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on the Brindle brothers, particularly Anthony Tony Brindle and Patrick Brindle. They had the motive, revenge, and, in the eyes of the police, the audacity to carry out such an attack. Within weeks, Tony and Patrick were arrested and charged with Abdullah's murder. It was a high-profile case, pitting prosecutors against 2 of South London's most notorious gangster siblings. The trial at the Old Bailey in 1992 was tense, but in the end, the evidence presented wasn't enough to convict. Key witnesses either disappeared, claimed to recall nothing, or refused to testify, likely petrified of retribution. Lacking cooperative eyewitnesses and with no murder weapon recovered, the jury returned verdicts of not guilty. Tony and Patrick Brindle walked free, smirking at the outcome. To the Arifs and their supporters, the acquittal was a travesty, proof that their enemy had literally gotten away with murder. To the Brindles, it was a vindication and perhaps even an encouragement, a sign that they could strike at the Arifs and escape punishment. Any hope that Abdullah's daylight slaying would conclude the tit-for-tat was shattered just a few months later. In August 1991, violence struck again, this time in a dingy South London pub that served as a frequent hangout for Brindle family members. David Brindle, the younger brother of Tony and Patrick, was having a drink at the Bell pub on East Street in Woolworth. If David felt safe on his home turf that evening, it was a fatal miscalculation. As midnight approached, two men in balaclavas burst into the Bell brandishing shotguns. Without hesitation, they opened fire on their target. David Brindle was hit multiple times and died almost instantly amid the toppled chairs and shattered pint glasses. In the wild spray of buckshot, an innocent bystander, 47-year-old Stanley Silk, who had simply been enjoying a drink, was also killed, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the gunmen was heard roaring a chilling declaration before fleeing, "This is for Abby." The meaning could not have been clearer. The Arifs had avenged their cousin Abdullah in the most direct way possible, by slaughtering a member of the Brindle family in public and doing so with a pronouncement that tied the act to Abby's name. The double murder at the Bell took the feud to its grimmest peak. In less than a year, the underworld war had claimed multiple lives on both sides. South London was in the grip of gangland terror, reminiscent of the worst days of the craze, but this war was less predictable. It could erupt anywhere, anytime, and any bystander was at risk of becoming collateral damage. Scotland Yard poured resources into quelling the violence. The South East Regional Crime Squad coordinated with local police units to monitor known gang figures, hoping to preempt the next strike. They feared, rightly so, that the cycle of revenge would continue indefinitely unless all sides were brought to heel. Amid this climate of vendetta, one particularly dangerous figure loomed, a man who might hold the key to some of the bloodshed, but who was as elusive as a ghost: Jimmy Moody. James "Jimmy" Moody was a notorious hitman, an underworld freelancer with ties to various factions. Moody had once run with the old-school London gangsters, but by 1991 he was a free agent. He had been on the run from prison since 1980, and in those years he was believed to have committed contract killings for different crime bosses, always for a price. When David Brindle was gunned down at the Bell, many in both the underworld and the police suspected Moody's hand in it. Perhaps he was one of the masked triggermen. Perhaps he orchestrated the hit behind the scenes. It was widely believed that the Arifs, determined to ensure their revenge was swift and untraceable, had hired Jimmy Moody to eliminate David Brindle as payback for Abby's murder. Proof of Moody's involvement never surfaced in court, and he remained a fugitive. But if he was indeed the hitman, fate soon caught up with him as well. In June 1993, Jimmy Moody was himself shot dead in an East London pub, in what was presumed to be a revenge hit or a dispute over underworld business. Thus ended the life of one of Gangland's most feared killers. His death closed one mysterious chapter of the feud, perhaps ensuring that whatever secrets he carried about the Arifs and Brindles went to the grave with him. After 1991's spate of killings, a weary calm settled in South London. The Arif and Brindle families had both paid in blood. Each clan had lost a brother. Both had members facing serious criminal charges or on the run. There were tentative signs that the worst was over. Through 1992 and 1993, overt violence between the groups subsided. Some speculated that the gangs, under pressure from both the police and their own mounting losses, reached an understanding to halt the carnage. Others believed the feud simmered on in smaller skirmishes and would flare up again when least expected. However, the uneasy peace was broken in 1995 by an audacious attempt on a life that could have reignited all-out war. Anthony "Tony" Brindle, acquitted of Abi Abdullah's murder and now the de facto leader of the Brindle crew, was a marked man. He moved cautiously, aware that the Arifs, or their remaining allies, might still seek vengeance. What Tony did not know was that a plan to kill him was already in motion, involving a hired gunman from beyond Britain's shores. On the morning of 20 September 1995, Tony Brindle stepped out of his house in Rotherhithe to go about his day's business. Unbeknownst to him, police had been conducting a covert surveillance operation around his home for weeks. They had received intelligence of a credible threat. A hitman had been imported from Ireland and contracted to assassinate Tony as part of the lingering gang dispute. That day, the surveillance team included officers concealed in a utilities van parked on Tony's street, watching and waiting. As Tony approached his car, a man hiding inside a parked van across the road raised a shotgun and fired through the vehicle's windscreen. The blast caught Tony Brindle in the stomach and legs, dropping him to the pavement in agony. In an instant, the quiet residential street erupted into chaos once more. The undercover officers from the utilities van sprang out, shouting a warning and aiming their firearms at the assailant. The gunman, a 49-year-old from Dublin, hopped out of his van, shotgun in hand, prepared to finish the job or shoot his way out. He never got the chance. Police marksmen opened fire, riddling the hitman with bullets and sending him crashing to the ground with severe wounds to his chest, arm and leg. When the smoke cleared, Tony Brindle was bleeding badly but alive and being rushed to the hospital. The would-be assassin lay critically injured under police guard. It emerged that this hitman was not some local thug, but an Irish mercenary with no ties to British gangs. A ghost brought in solely for this contract killing. His hiring hinted strongly at Arif involvement. It bore the hallmarks of their strategizing, using outsiders to do their dirty work and thus obscure the trail. Incredibly, both men survived that morning. Tony Brindle underwent emergency surgery and pulled through, soon swearing he would never be caught off guard like that again. The Irish gunman also survived his wounds and was taken into custody, facing a litany of charges. The incident embarrassed the Metropolitan Police to an extent. Tony had been under their watch and still ended up shot, but it also highlighted their determination. They had anticipated the hit, and albeit a split second too late to prevent Tony's injury, they prevented his murder and captured the triggerman. In doing so, they likely averted a fresh wave of retaliation killings that would have followed if Tony Brindle had died. After the Rotherhithe shooting, even the most hard-headed figures on both sides had to reckon with reality. The feud that had started 5 years earlier had nearly cost Tony his life, and it was only through sheer luck and police intervention that it didn't. The Arifs, by now much diminished in strength, had nevertheless shown they were still willing and able to strike. But continuing this war promised only mutual destruction. By the late 1990s, an extraordinary development finally put the feud to rest. Not a ceasefire negotiated at gunpoint, but a union at the altar. In a twist almost Shakespearean in its irony, a member of the Brindle clan and a member of the Arif clan fell in love and married. Johnny Brindle, a relative of Tony Brindle, wed a young woman named Debbie Arif. This marriage created a direct familial link between two families that had been spilling each other's blood. With kinship now in the mix, the appetite for revenge sharply waned. Neither the Brindles nor the Arifs could continue to target the other without potentially harming their own extended family. Sources close to the underworld say this marriage, more than any police action, effectively ended the Arif-Daley Brindle feud. The guns were finally silenced, and an uneasy peace settled in South London's Gangland. Even as the feud was winding down in the mid-90s, law enforcement was on a parallel mission: to destroy the Arif crime family's criminal empire itself. The dramatic events of November 1990 in Reigate had been the first major strike. After the arrest of Deniz and Mehmet Arif during the Securicor robbery attempt, prosecutors ensured these two would not see freedom for a long time. In 1991, they were convicted on charges including armed robbery and attempted murder for the shots fired at police. Deniz Arif received 22 years and Mehmet Arif 18 years in prison. These stiff sentences removed two kingpins from the street and sent a clear message to their remaining brothers. The authorities were closing in. With two of the gang's field commanders taken out, the police turned up the heat on the rest of the Arifs. Dogan Arif, considered the godfather of the family, was a prime target. His penchant for extreme violence was well known, and he was suspected of overseeing much of the family's drug trafficking operations. It wasn't long before Dogan too fell into the legal dragnet. Through joint efforts of the Metropolitan Police and HM Customs, Dogan was implicated in a massive heroin smuggling scheme. He was arrested and tried for his role in an $8.5 million drug importation plot. The evidence was strong enough, and by the mid-1990s, Dogan Arif was convicted and handed a 14-year sentence. With him in a cell, the Arif family had lost its fiercest leader on the outside. As the crackdown intensified, British authorities also improved coordination. In 1995, the newly formed National Criminal Intelligence Service, NCIS, began a pilot program to centralize information on organized crime figures. They compiled a list of hundreds of major players across the country. And unsurprisingly, the largest concentration was in London's southeast, where the Arifs and their peers operated. For the first time, police forces were pooling intelligence on gangs like the Arifs on a national level. This meant that whether the Arifs tried to hide in another city or diversify into new crimes, multiple law enforcement agencies would be sharing data and watching. The noose was tightening from all sides. Even as these major players were removed, one key figure still eluded capture: Bekir, the Duke Arif. After finishing his 5-year stint for the 1977 robbery, Bekir had remained deep in the family business. By the 1990s, many believed it was he who managed the Arifs' drug empire behind the scenes. While Dogan and others dealt with the street-level enforcement and occasional violence, Bekir kept the international connections alive and handled the high finance of crime. He was careful, more businessman than gangster in his methods, always keeping a low profile, rarely handling drugs or guns directly, and thus staying a step removed from the evidence trail. Throughout the mid-90s, surveillance and informant reports hinted that Bekir was orchestrating major drug deals. The National Crime Squad launched an undercover operation to get concrete proof. After months of patient work, they caught a break. In late 1997, investigators picked up on plans for an exceptionally large heroin transaction involving Bekir and overseas suppliers. Tailing meetings and tapping phones, they amassed hours of recordings and surveillance footage. The evidence painted a damning picture. Bekir Arif negotiating the import of 100 kilograms of heroin, discussing logistics, pricing, and distribution with an assumed air of impunity. In early 1998, the trap was sprung. Bekir Arif and several associates were arrested in a coordinated sweep. At his Old Bailey trial in 1999, Bekir, then in his mid-40s, tried to play the role of the bewildered, legitimate businessman. He even likened himself to Del Boy, the lovable rogue from television, claiming he had stumbled unwittingly into a conspiracy. But the jury heard the wiretap tapes and saw through the act. He was convicted of conspiracy to supply 100 kilograms of heroin, worth an estimated $12.5 million, and sentenced to 23 years in prison. The judge lambasted Bekir's cynicism and noted there was no shred of mitigation in his crimes. For the Arif family, Bekir's downfall was perhaps the most devastating blow yet. He was the third Arif brother to receive a massive prison term in that decade. In 2013, Britain's Serious Organised Crime Agency, SOCIA, ranked Bekir Arif among the country's most toxic crime bosses, signaling that law enforcement still viewed the Arifs as a serious ongoing threat. That assessment proved apt. In July 2015, acting on intelligence, police raided a remote caravan in Somerset. Inside, they found 48 kilograms of high-purity amphetamine, a huge cache of drugs destined for the streets. The evidence from that operation traced straight back to Bekir the Duke Arif. Even as a supposedly monitored ex-convict in his 60s, Bekir had been orchestrating yet another narcotics enterprise from the shadows. He was duly arrested, and in March 2016 he stood in court once again. This time, he received an 11.5-year prison sentence for conspiring to supply amphetamines and for brazenly breaching the serious crime prevention order designed to curb his activities. It appeared that nothing short of a prison cell could keep the Duke from his old ways. By this time, the Arif family as a dominant force in organized crime had been largely dismantled. The empire they built through the 1980s had not survived the onslaught of the 1990s intact. Many of the brothers would spend the rest of their prime years and beyond incarcerated. Those who eventually emerged from prison did so as older men, with their territories long lost and the criminal landscape changed beyond recognition. There was simply no slot for the Arifs to slip back into. Other gangs and new crime syndicates had filled the void. Yet even as the Arifs' reign was broken, not all traces of their influence disappeared. The family had always been extended and secretive. Dozens of associates and relatives had been involved at various levels. In the 2000s and 2010s, there were occasional murmurs in the underworld that some low-key drug operations or fraud schemes still had Arif fingerprints on them. These were never large or brazen enough to attract the kind of headlines or heat of earlier times, but they hinted that the Arif legacy lived on in some shape or form. The police, for their part, remained vigilant. Whenever an Arif brother was released, surveillance teams took note. Any time a major bust involved Turkish Cypriot criminals in South London, one of the questions quietly asked was, "Does this tie back to the Arifs?" Mostly those fears did not materialize. The old lions had been caged, and the younger generation seemed disinclined to wear the crown of infamy. The streets that the Arifs once dominated gradually grew calmer and safer. In the neighborhoods of Peckham, Walworth, and Camberwell, new businesses opened, new waves of immigrants came and built their lives, and a sense of normalcy returned. But people who lived through the Arif era did not forget. Among older South Londoners, the family's name still invokes a shiver. There are pub owners who can recall the envelope of cash they used to hand over every month for protection, and former club bouncers who remember seeing the Arif's enforcers looming in the doorway to ensure the night's trade went their way. These memories ensure that the Arif's spectre still lingers, even if the men themselves are gone or retired. Today, the Arifs are part of London's criminal folklore. They are mentioned in the same breath as the Crays, the Richardsons, and the Adamses when people speak of the capital's historic crime families. But unlike the Crays, who became pop cultural anti-heroes of a sort, the Arifs never attained a gloss of glamour. They remained dark, lurking figures, more feared than admired. Their story is recounted not with nostalgia, but with a kind of grim appreciation for the scale of their deeds and the extent of their downfall. Walk into certain South London cafes on a quiet afternoon, and you might find a few grey-haired gentlemen reminiscing in Turkish. Listen carefully, and perhaps you'll catch a reference to Dogan or the Duke. These murmured conversations are the echoes of the Arif legacy. For the most part, the participants are not eager to broadcast what they know. They lived through dangerous times, and old habits of silence die hard. Still, in those guarded recollections, the legend of the Arif crime family endures, passed on like a cautionary tale to those who will listen. The Arif crime family's trajectory offers a deeply sobering lesson in the world of organized crime. It underscores how a combination of ambition, ruthlessness, and opportunity allowed a group of brothers to rise from a South London council estate to the pinnacle of Britain's underworld. It also demonstrates how that same ruthlessness invited equally unyielding responses. Rival gangs trying to kill them, and the police devoting entire task forces to bring them down. The family's rise was steep, and its fall, though prolonged, was inevitable. For law enforcement, the battle against the Arifs was a formative one. The police had to innovate, coordinating across jurisdictions, employing deep surveillance, and cultivating informants in closed communities. They had to learn from mistakes, like underestimating how far the gangs would go or how much fear would stifle witnesses, and adapt new strategies to counter a new breed of criminal family. In many ways, the effort to stop the Arifs helped modernize British policing of organized crime. It spurred the creation of centralized intelligence units and fostered international cooperation, since drugs and guns do not respect borders. In some respects, the Arif saga also marked the end of an era. As their family was brought low, London's underworld shifted. The age of tight-knit domestic crime families gave way to a new epoch of international cartels and transient gang alliances. Few organizations would again achieve the kind of local infamy and cohesion the Arifs had. Their story remains a stark bookend to the history of London's traditional crime families, a final bloody flourish before the underworld changed shape for the new millennium. In the end, what remains of the Arif family are the stories and the scars. A generation of detectives who cut their teeth pursuing the Arifs have since retired, their memoirs and recollections adding to the record of how formidable the family once was. The communities that lived in the shadow of the Arifs' reign have moved on, but the older residents can still point out the sites of key events. That's where the betting shop was, where Abby was killed, or here used to stand the Bell pub, scene of the Brindle shooting. These locations are part of the everyday landscape now, but they are also quiet monuments to a bloody history. And so, the tale of the Arif crime family concludes as a chapter in London's ever-evolving underworld narrative. From humble beginnings to a notorious peak, And ultimately, to a hard fall, the Arifs embodied both the possibilities and the perils of organized crime. They built an empire through cunning and cruelty and saw it crumble under the weight of vengeance and law. Their name, once powerful enough to make hardened criminals think twice, has now receded into the annals of crime history. Yet its echo persists, a reminder that for a time, in the back streets and council estates of South London, an empire of crime ruled by brothers cast a long and terrifying shadow until, inevitably, the light caught up with them.